As I mentioned in our last lecture, by 1939 the New Deal had more or less run its course, and the Roosevelt administration was becoming increasingly preoccupied by events taking place not in the United States but in Asia and Europe. On a global level, very bad things were happening in both areas. In Asia, the Japanese Empire invaded Manchuria in 1931 and conscripted hundreds of thousands of Chinese into slave labor, and then moved even farther into China after occupying the city of Nanjing and massacring approximately 300,000 people, prisoners of war and civilians. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, Adolf Hitler consolidated power in Germany. He rearmed the country in violation of the Treaty of World War I. He banned other political parties, making only his Nazi party legal. He then began persecuting Jews, Catholics, Roma people, and communists, and others, throwing them into concentration camps. And then he annexed Austria, and then he occupied Czechoslovakia, and then he invaded Poland, upon which Britain and France declared war. Despite these worrisome events, most Americans did not want to become involved in what became known as World War II. They had a bitter taste in their mouth from the aftermath of the Great War, as it was called back then, and now World War I, which Woodrow Wilson had promised would be the war to end all wars. Obviously, it hadn't turned out that way. Many students had embraced pacifism during the 1930s. Many Americans now believe that the U.S. had gotten into World War I because bankers and arms dealers had lobbied the Wilson administration. I don't think that's the reason why Wilson got the U.S. into the war, but there's no doubt that chemical companies and banks profited handsomely from it. Many Americans had ethnic loyalties to Germany or its ally, Italy, or were Irish American or were not interested in protecting the British Empire. Or, in some instances, they supported Hitler. Yeah, that's right. Henry Ford, the auto magnate, did business with Hitler through the 1930s. His Ford plants in Germany benefited from slave labor provided by the German government. He even published an anti-Semitic book titled The International Jew. As a result of all these sentiments, during the 1930s, Congress passed a variety of laws called the Neutrality Acts, which banned travel on belligerent ships. Belligerent means hostile or aggressive. But Roosevelt and his allies in Congress became convinced that Hitler posed a direct threat to the United States, and that if Hitler allied himself with Japan, the threat would be magnified even further. A big debate ensued in the USA over how much to help Britain and France, as Hitler bombed London and now occupied Paris. Gradually, the U.S. began helping the Allies. In 1941, Congress passed Lend-Lease, which allowed the USA to provide military aid for Britain and France on the proviso that they returned the assistance after the war. FDR also began demanding that Japan withdraw from China and froze Japanese assets in the United States when Japan's leaders refused. The debate about intervention continued until the Japanese military settled matters themselves. They decided to attack Pearl Harbor Base in Hawaii in the hope that this would discourage the USA from becoming more involved in the Pacific. By November of 1941, the U.S. military knew that the Japanese Empire was going to attack the U.S. somewhere because they had figured out how to decrypt Japan's diplomatic cables, messages sent wirelessly across the Pacific Ocean in encrypted language. So they sent out a general warning across the Pacific to United States bases. But the Army could not figure out where Japan was going to attack, and they didn't think that the Japanese Navy and Air Force would or could travel 4,000 miles from Japan to attack Pearl Harbor Base. So they were shocked when Japanese planes roared into the base, killing 2,000 servicemen and damaging 200 aircraft and ships. The next day, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. Hitler's declaration of war on the U.S. was sort of impulsive. Apparently, he didn't consult anyone. He just told his staff to declare war. Partly, I think that he did not realize the enormous industrial potential of the USA and the degree to which the U.S.'s involvement would tip the global balance on behalf of Hitler's enemies, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, which Hitler had attacked in 1941. But the bottom line was that the U.S. was now in World War II, and World War II would transform the United States in unexpected ways. Your textbook calls World War II the gross national product war. What this means is that the war really hinged on which side had the most weapons and the most population. And obviously the Allies, the US, the Soviet Union, China, Britain, and France, had that surplus. By 1943, after some initial defeats, the U.S. turned the tide in the Pacific. In May of 1943, the U.S. Navy repulsed a Japanese Empire attempt to invade Australia. In June of 1943, the U.S. triumphed in the terrible Battle of Midway Island, which was fought almost entirely with fighter planes, and during which Japan lost 4 precious aircraft carriers and its best-trained fighter pilots, which meant it lost military control of the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. could now transport its huge armada from island to island on the way to an invasion of Japan. Meanwhile, in Europe, by that same month, June, Nazi Germany was on the run. A year earlier, the Germans had launched a siege of the Russian city of Stalingrad, which quickly became a catastrophe. By then, the U.S. had supplied the Russians with trucks, artillery, planes, and millions of guns. Hitler had not anticipated how much weaponry the United States could produce in so short a period of time. As summer transitioned to winter, Russian winter, the Red Army surrounded the Germans and forced them to surrender. 800,000 German troops and 1,200,000 Russians died in the battle, which I think remains the single worst battle in human history. Now, at a cost of approximately 20 million casualties, the Red Army pushed the Nazis back to Berlin, while in June of 1944, the U.S., Canada, and Britain launched their D-Day offensive in Normandy, France. 6 months later, Hitler tried to stop the onslaught via a 1,000-tank counter-offensive in Belgium, but ultimately, quite literally, ran out of gas, and the Allies overwhelmed his forces, their tanks and trucks and soldiers moving so thickly together that the conflict became known as the Battle of the Bulge. By January of 1945, the Allies were heading west for Berlin from Belgium, south from Rome, and east from Warsaw. The Nazis were doomed. The big question for people in the United States was, what was the larger meaning of the war? What was the answer to that question? People did not agree on everything, but one thing was for sure. World War II got the USA out of the Depression. The number of federal workers alone rose from 1 to 4 million, and then there were the vast number of privately hired war production workers. The unemployment rate dropped from 25% during the early years of the Depression to 14% in 1940 to 2% in 1943. By 1944, if you didn't have a job in the USA, it was because you didn't want to work, or you were 3 years old, or you were in a coma. What was this war for then? Just to stop Hitler and the Japanese Empire, or was it for something? Franklin Roosevelt attempted to define the meaning of the conflict even before the U.S. got involved in the fighting. In January of 1941, he appeared before Congress and he gave his famous For Freedom speech. And he said, and I quote, "In the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded on 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants, everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor, anywhere in the world. That is no vision of a distant millennium. It is a definite basis for a kind of world attainable in our time and our generation." That's what FDR said. For millions of Americans listening to FDR's speech and living in a country with a long history of racism, this was great news. They were definitely ready for some improvements in their time and generation. The wartime messages that the U.S. government put out could obviously be turned right back on U.S. society itself. At one point, FDR declared that, quote, "There has never been, and there isn't now, and there never will be any race of people on the earth fit to serve as masters over their fellow men." But the Nazis literally made fun of these statements, pointing out that Jim Crow segregation was endemic not just in the Deep South, but in Washington, D.C., where the Red Cross refused to mix blood from blacks and whites in its blood banks. In 1941, as FDR was making speeches about helping free peoples in Europe, over a dozen lynchings took place in the USA. In 1944, a black minister named Isaac Simmons was murdered for refusing to sell his land to a white man. The murder took place in a Missouri town called Liberty. When World War II began, the Air Force and Marines had no black members. The Army contained 5 black officers. The Navy accepted black people only as waiters and cooks. During the war, more than 1 million black Americans served in the armed forces, but they did so in segregated units. Many black soldiers sent to the South for training found themselves excluded from movie theaters and restaurants thanks to Jim Crow segregation. When they traveled on trains, black soldiers sometimes were asked to give up their seats on railroad cars to make room for white German prisoners of war. Often German prisoners of war could go into southern towns and go to restaurants and movie theaters where black trainees could not. Not surprisingly, a critical mass of black activists lost patience with this situation. During the war, membership in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People went from 50,000 to 500,000 people, and black soldiers began talking about the double V. Victory over Germany and Japan, they insisted, had to include victory over segregation in the United States. That meant that the 4 freedoms had to count for all races, not just for the white people on those posters, which I showed you earlier. One of those activists was a man named A. Philip Randolph, a black labor leader who called for a march on Washington specifically to protest discrimination against people of color in hiring for defense plants, that is, factories that made weapons for the war, but also to protest segregation and to call for a national law against lynching, basically taking black people out of prisons and hanging them by mobs. The purpose of the march was to embarrass Washington, D.C. into doing something about discrimination, and FDR was in fact embarrassed, and he promised that he would do something if Randolph called off the march. And so FDR issued Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in defense jobs and, more importantly, created a national commission to monitor compliance. It was called the Fair Employment Practices Commission, and it was the first federal civil rights program since Reconstruction. Many communities of color took advantage of the Fair Employment Practices Commission. These included Mexican-American citizens. In the barrios of Los Angeles, they called themselves the Pachucos, Mexican-American men who came to the barrio via El Paso, Texas. They were self-styled tough guys who lived on the edge of poverty and who wore their hair long and wore zoot suits. What was a zoot suit? It was a, quote, zoot suit with a neat pleat, with a drape shape and a stiff cuff, as one popular song explained. The shoulders bulged with the aid of 3 to 6 inches of padding. The trousers measured 3 feet at the knees and narrowed at the ankles to less than 12 inches. The trouser waistband was up to the armpits, while the jacket reached to the knees. The suit usually came in dazzling colors. Zoot suiters wore string ties, pearl buttons, and a yard or 2 of gold watch chain, which they twirled about ostentatiously. As the historian Geoffrey Perrott puts it, the zoot suit was nothing less than a, quote, frontal assault on traditional Western conceptions of symmetry, proportion, balance, taste, and moderation. It was peacock clothing, pure and simple. As blacks and Latinos migrated to the cities of the North and Southwest in search of work, racial tensions mounted once again. Detroit quickly became a city of translated Southerners of both races crammed together with Slavic immigrants. The leadership of the powerful United Auto Workers was militantly anti-racist, but often union leaders were ahead of their members. Fighting between blacks and whites and Latinos at hiring halls became common. On July 13, 1943, a riot broke out in the Detroit suburb of Inkster Park when several hundred black and white youth fought a pitched battle with fists and rocks. By the next day, a rumor had spread in a black ghetto in Detroit that a group of white men had murdered a black woman and her baby and thrown their bodies into the river. Furious blacks rushed downtown to protest, and they were met by mobs of whites who hunted them down and killed them where they stood. The luckiest were caught by the police and taken downtown. 17 blacks were shot by the police. Whites burned and looted without being arrested or harassed. Only when soldiers arrived was the riot brought under control. 35 people died, 700 were wounded, 1,300 people were arrested. Around the same time, a young Mexican named Jose Diaz was found lying by a dirt road on the outskirts of the city. No proof of foul play could be found. He had probably been hurt in an auto accident, but the Los Angeles Police Department used his death as an excuse for a massive roundup of gang members who hung around a pond called Sleepy Lagoon. The cops beat confessions from most of them. 2 had the good sense to ask for a separate trial. They found a lawyer who quickly got the charges dismissed for lack of evidence. 20 others were prosecuted. 12 were convicted of murder and sentenced to life at San Quentin prison. But local civil rights leaders championed their innocence, and in 1944, all Sleepy Lagoon defendants were released for lack of evidence for conviction. Nonetheless, 2 major Los Angeles newspapers responded to the anxiety about this and the war to whip up a mythical Mexican crime wave on the front pages. The city council did the stupidest thing they possibly could do in response. They made it a crime to wear a zoot suit. As zoot suiters defied the law, heavily armed police swept into East Los Angeles at all hours, making arrests and sudden searches. People who carried beer can openers in their pockets were declared dangers to society. The county sheriff declared that Mexicans had a, quote, biological predisposition to criminal tendencies. Signs went up throughout the city that said, "We only serve the white race." And local police and club-wielding sailors descended upon the barrio, physically attacking Latinos where they stood. These were called the Zoot Suit riots. And they galvanized Mexican Americans to protest their third-class status in the military. In response, the legislature of Texas, which had the largest population of people of Mexican background, unanimously passed a resolution with a very strange name, the Caucasian Race Equal Privileges Resolution. It stated that, quote, all the nations of the North and South American continents were unified in the battle against Nazism, which was news to Mexican Americans in Los Angeles. Even more complex was the very evolving relationship of various Asian American groups to the United States during the Second World War. When we think about the Second World War and Asian Americans, I think for most people, we're thinking about the Japanese American internment camps, and we're going to talk about them soon. But for much of the West Coast Asian American community, World War II presented opportunities. Suddenly they were on the same side as the United States. This was particularly the case for Filipinos, Koreans, Chinese, and Indians from the Asian subcontinent, all of whom were on the side of the Allies, either because they were part of the British Empire or because Japan had occupied their nation. Americans immediately came to rethink their relationship with various Asian American groups around this time. The Philippines became an American colony at the turn of the 20th century after the Philippine-American War, which is a brutal war about which most American school children learn little. At least 100,000 Filipinos died in their unsuccessful war of independence against the United States. Between 1906 and 1935, more than 150,000 Filipinos immigrated to the United States, and they were classified as American nationals and were routinely discriminated against at jobs and housing. In Hawaii, Filipinos became the largest workforce on sugar and pineapple plantations. In the mainland, they tended to wind up in low-paying agricultural jobs. Ironically, by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan, when the U.S. was drawn into World War II, racist legislation had reclassified Filipinos as aliens ineligible for citizenship. This meant that they were ineligible to join the U.S. Armed Forces. Filipinos in the U.S. regarded this as just one more indignity until Pearl Harbor and the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. Then the Filipino community petitioned FDR for the right to fight, and General Douglas MacArthur, whose forces had been driven out of the Philippines, welcomed the troops. Filipinos were now fighting with Americans against the Japanese. One Filipino wrote to a friend in a letter, "No longer on the streetcar do I feel myself in the presence of my enemies. We Filipinos are the same. It is Americans who have changed in their recognition of us." Another, who worked on railroad cars, wrote, "I'm very much embarrassed. They treat me as if I have just arrived from Bataan, a city in the Philippines where resistance to the Japanese was intense but unsuccessful." In California, 40% of the state's Filipino population registered for the first draft. In 1942, the first Filipino infantry regiment was formed, and then the second. 7,000 served in these two regiments. They saw this as a dual opportunity to save the Philippines and to become Americans. One soldier wrote, "In a few months, I will be wearing Uncle Sam's olive drab Army uniform. I'm looking forward to that day, not with misgiving, but with a boyish anticipation of doing something which up to now I've never been allowed to do, serving as an equal with American boys." Although most of these soldiers were young, many of these men were in their late 30s and early 40s. Some were in their early 50s, but they were all hard and tough from years of agricultural labor. One battalion, the so-called 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, served as an advanced espionage unit for MacArthur's returning forces. Its members all knew a wide variety of Filipino dialects. They infiltrated Manila, the capital of the Philippines, and set up secret radio stations to inform U.S. forces of the weaknesses in the Japanese occupation. These soldiers showed indescribable bravery. Some were caught and tortured to death by the Japanese. It is unlikely that MacArthur would have retaken the Philippines without them. Then there were Korean Americans. Korean Americans welcomed the war as an opportunity to free Korea from Japan, but government policies failed to distinguish them from the Japanese. The 1940 Alien Registration Act classified them as subjects of Japan, and this made Koreans furious. One Korean wrote to a friend, "For years, we've been fighting the Japanese, and now they tell us that we're Japanese. It's an insult. Why in the hell do they pull a trick like this on us when we hate the Japanese more than anyone else in the world?" Koreans were anxious to become involved in the war against Japan. They joined the California National Guard. They purchased no less than $239,000 worth of defense bonds, not bad for a population of 10,000 men, women, and children. Meanwhile, Asian Indians had been denied citizenship in the United States. In 1923, the Supreme Court had ruled constitutional a decision that Indians were ineligible for naturalized citizenship. In 1939, a bill was introduced to Congress to provide citizenship for all Asian Indian immigrants living in the U.S. since 1924. But one hostile politician warned, "First, it will be the people who are in this country now, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Hindus, who want to be naturalized. Then they will find some other means of breaking some other little hole in the immigration law, and here and there and elsewhere." But in 1941, FDR and Winston Churchill issued the Atlantic Charter, a statement of the rights of peoples to fair representation in government. And in response, Indian leaders made statements. And I quote, "If the United States is successfully to combat racist ideas, it can ill afford to practice racial discrimination in its relations with Asiatic countries. The immigration policy of this country now excludes nearly a quarter of the human race. America cannot afford to say that she wants the people of India to fight on her side and at the same time maintain that she will not have them among her immigrant groups." U.S. troops fought beside Indian troops in Southeast Asia and learned of their courage. By 1946, Congress let Indian nationals have an immigration quota. 12,000 Indians came to the United States. Hundreds became citizens. But the situation was most complex for the Chinese, who had been persecuted in the United States since the Gold Rush, and whose immigration to the U.S. had, since the late 19th century, been blocked and curtailed by the Chinese Exclusion Act. The day after Pearl Harbor Day, the Republic of China and the United States became allies. Shortly after that, Time magazine, which is a very important national magazine in the USA, wrote an embarrassing piece titled, quote, and I quote, "How to Tell Your Friends from the Japs," end of quote, which purported to explain the differences between Japanese and Chinese people to white Americans. One U.S. congressman noted the transformation. The Chinese had been viewed with scorn. Then came Pearl Harbor, he noted. All at once we discovered the saintly qualities of the Chinese people. If it had not been for December 7th, the attack on Pearl Harbor, I do not think we would have ever found out how good they were. Chinese Americans wore black armbands to distinguish themselves from Japanese Americans. Patriotism for China and America exploded throughout the West Coast. Here's from a Chinese newspaper, a memo to Mr. Hitler, Hirohito, and company. And it read, and I quote, "America is out to get you. San Francisco, Chinatown, USA is joining the party. Chinatown will have fun blasting you to hell. Chinatown is proud to be part of Freedom's Legion in freeing all the decent people of the world from your spectacle. P.S. More bad news. Everyone in Chinatown is going to this party. We're not missing this one." 13,499 Chinese Americans were drafted into or enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces, 22% of all adult males. Suddenly there was a way out of Chinatown, out of the restaurants and into higher-paying industrial jobs. Restaurants closed down because they couldn't find waiters. Many laundry workers became riveters. College-educated Chinese became defense plant engineers. Chinese American women became office workers, or some even got jobs working lathes in defense plants. Like other groups, Chinese Americans accused the government of hypocrisy. Quote, "Surely racial discrimination should not be directed against those who are America's allies in the Far East and are helping her in every way to win the war," read one statement. In 1942, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, wife of the President of China, came to the United States and gave a speech to Congress. She urged America to repeal the Chinese exclusion law. Koreans and Indian groups also called for its repeal. Japanese propagandists had argued for Chinese-Japanese unity on the basis of U.S.-Chinese exclusion, on the basis of the way the U.S. was treating its Chinese residents. On October 11th, 1943, President Roosevelt declared, "China is our ally. For many long years, she stood alone in the fight against aggression. Today, we fight at her side. She has continued her gallant struggle against very great odds. By the repeal of the Chinese exclusion laws, we can correct a historic mistake and silence the distorted Japanese propaganda." Japan watched the bill with great interest. When it was delayed, Japanese propaganda radio responded, quote, "Agitation in the U.S. for the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act met an early death due to the opposition of anti-Asiatic congressmen, which bears out the fact that it was never meant to be sincere, that it was only a gesture, just empty words." This caused Roosevelt to push harder for the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. One retired Navy officer told a congressional committee that the Chinese Exclusion Act was worth 20 divisions to the Japanese Empire. "Please repeal it," he said. And so Congress did, providing a very restrictive naturalization law for Chinese people, Chinese Americans, but it was a start. But while all these groups benefited, Japanese Americans paid the ultimate price. The big question, I think for many historians, is why were Japanese Americans in California and Oregon interned and Japanese in Hawaii not? No sooner did the war start than people started calling Japanese Americans a threat. They were not. They liked living in the USA. They didn't want to return to militarist Japan. The military governor of Hawaii knew that internment and removal was not necessary. He said that Japanese labor was essential to Hawaii's economy, about 30% of the workers of Japanese ancestry, and he issued a press statement. And I quote, "There are 160,000 of these people who want to live here because they like the country and the American way of life. The citizens of Japanese blood would fight as loyally for America as any other citizen. I have read or heard nothing in statements given out by the military, local police, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation since December 7th to change my opinion, and I've gone out of my way to ask for the facts." In truth, Japanese Americans throughout Hawaii fought to defend the island from the Japanese Empire. There were 2,000 in the army there, and most of them had lived longer in Hawaii than in Japan. Almost 10,000 Nisei, Hawaii men, volunteered for the army. Indeed, in the days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, sympathetic politicians warned against judging Japanese Americans. These included Representative John M. Coffey in Congress, and he said, "It's my fervent hope and prayer that residents of the United States of Japanese extraction will not be made victims of pogroms directed by self-proclaimed patriots and hysterical self-anointed heroes." Even before the war, the U.S. had done a secret report on Japanese American loyalty, and it concluded that for the most part, I'm quoting here, "the local Japanese are loyal to the United States or, at worst, hope that by remaining quiet they can avoid concentration camps and irresponsible mobs. We do not believe that they would be at least any more disloyal than any other racial group in the United States with whom we went to war." But pretty soon, demagogic newspapers in California started putting pressure on the government to move the Japanese Americans to internment camps. The Los Angeles Times declared that, and I quote, "A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents grows up to be a Japanese, not an American." Henry McLeanmore, a big syndicated columnist back in those days, declared, "I'm for the immediate removal of every Japanese on the West Coast to a point deep in the interior, and I don't mean a nice part of the interior either. Herd them up, pack them off, and give them the inside of the Badlands." The strongest pressure for internment came from big West Coast agriculture, whose spokespersons made no effort, absolutely no effort, to conceal why they wanted this measure taken. A representative from the Grower Shipper Vegetable Association stated in the Saturday Evening Post, which was a very popular magazine back then, and I quote, "We've been charged with wanting to get rid of the Japs for selfish reasons. We may as well be honest. We do. It's a question of whether the white man lives on the Pacific coast or the brown man. They came into this valley to work, and they stayed to take over. If all the Japs were removed tomorrow, we'd never miss them in 2 weeks because the white farmers could take over and produce everything that the Jap grows." Bottom line, economic interests in California were greedy for the land Japanese Americans had developed. The boards of supervisors of 16 California counties passed resolutions urging removal. West Coast members of Congress became increasingly hysterical about the issue, such as Congressman John Ford, who declared to a newspaper, "I phoned the Attorney General's office and I gave them 24 hours notice that unless they would issue a mass evacuation notice, I would drag the whole matter on the floor of the House and give the bastards everything that we could with both barrels." And so, on February 19, 1942, Franklin Roosevelt, to his everlasting shame, signed Executive Order 9066, which gave the Secretary of War the right to restrict people from certain areas. This was not used against Italian or German Americans, but it was used against Japanese Americans on the West Coast. 110,000 of them, nearly 72,000 American citizens. From there, the military issued an order. All Japanese Americans will be evacuated by May 7, 1942, including children. Japanese were astounded. Years later, Congressman Robert Matsui reflected on the travesty. He said to a reporter, "How could I, as a 6-month-old child born in this country, be an enemy alien?" Men who refused to evacuate were sent to prison. Their cases went to the Supreme Court and were upheld. They were assigned to old fairgrounds, stockyards, and racetracks. As a graduate student in Southern California, I used to go to the Pomona County Fair, which was a former site for Japanese American internees. 10 internment camps: Utah, Arizona, Colorado, Arkansas, Idaho, Manzanar and Tule Lake in California, and Hart Mountain in Wyoming. Most of the camps were in remote desert areas. One internee remembered, and I quote, "We felt as if we were standing in a gigantic sand mixing machine as the 60-mile gale lifted the loose earth up into the sky, obliterating everything. Sand filled our mouths and our nostrils and stung our faces and hands like 1,000 darting needles. Families were herded into hastily built barracks. They ate in huge mess halls where they struggled to cook rice and vegetables. Older men in particular found this a crisis situation. They completely lost their authority. But for Nisei men, there was a way out: the draft. The questionnaire distributed to them had two key queries. Question 27 was, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States or combat duty? Question 28 was, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor? And people in these internment camps were like, now you ask us? Couldn't you have asked us before? In any event, most Nisei answered yes. Some insisted that they would not answer these questions until their citizenship was restored. Especially at one of the camps, 6 of their leaders were arrested for conspiring to violate the Selective Service Act and were sent to federal penitentiaries. Some of the victims of this process appealed to the courts. The most important of these appellants was a man named Fred Korematsu. Fred Korematsu lived in the San Francisco Bay Area during the internment. He had a nice welding job and a pretty Italian-American fiancée. According to his niece, Barbara Field, who later wrote about him, his favorite food was hamburgers. He ate a lot of hamburgers. And he wanted to live his Italian girlfriend, hamburger, American 8-hour day life and be happy. And he didn't see himself as a hero. So he faked a bunch of identity papers and he changed his name to Clyde Sarah and said he was of Spanish Hawaiian background. Well, too bad. One day he was walking down the street in San Leandro and the cops arrested him on a tip. So this fellow named Ernest Bessig read about this in the newspaper. Bessig was a lawyer for the American Civil Liberties Union, and he went to Korematsu and said to him, we want to take this case to the courts. Will you let us handle it? And Korematsu, somewhat to the surprise of Bessig, said, okay. And as the case went forward, a general submitted a great big document called the Final Report on the Japanese Evacuation of the West Coast. And it included charges that Japanese Americans had engaged in illegal radio transmissions. But an attorney from the Justice Department read the document and asked government radio engineers to double-check the charge, and a government technician got back to him and said he didn't think the report was true. The Justice Department then at first added a footnote to the document that essentially said there was a bunch of falsehoods in the document. But the Assistant Secretary of War saw this footnote and demanded that the Justice Department remove it. And so the document went to the Supreme Court without mention that the Justice Department thought it contained falsehoods. Deprived of this knowledge, the Supreme Court's majority held that Korematsu's and all Japanese American exclusion from the West Coast military area was constitutional. As one of the justices wrote, to cast this case into outlines of racial prejudice without reference to the real military dangers which were presented merely confuses the issue. Korematsu was not excluded from the military area because of hostility to him or his race. He was excluded because we were at war with the Japanese Empire, because the properly constituted military authorities feared an invasion of our West Coast and felt constrained to take proper security measures. But 3 Supreme Court justices dissented in the case. And one of them wrote, this exclusion of all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, from the Pacific Coast area on a plea of military necessity in the absence of martial law ought not to be approved. Such exclusion goes over the very brink of constitutional power and falls into the ugly abyss of racism. That decision was issued in December of 1944. By then, the presidential election of that year was over and the military began to evacuate the internment camps. During the war, 33,000 Nisei served in the United States Armed Forces. They played a crucial role in the Pacific Theater. They fought, served as spies, translators. They crawled close to Japanese officers and translated commands back to the line. Perhaps the most decorated regiments of the war, one of the most decorated regiments of the war, was the 442nd Regiment Combat Team, composed of Nisei from Hawaii and from the internment camps. When they came back, having sustained about 9,000 casualties, they were met by Hollywood actor Ronald Reagan, who made a speech for them, and I quote, "Blood that is soaked into the sands of a beach is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on a way and ideal. Not in spite of, but because of our polyglot background, we have had all the strength in the world. That is the American way." It must have been a very strange moment for these people. Your book author notes that in 1944, the dancer Sono Osato was in New York City performing the role of beauty queen in the Broadway musical On the Town. Meanwhile, her brother was fighting with the U.S. Army in the Pacific Theater, and her dad was sitting in an internment camp because he'd been born in Japan. Almost 40 years later, the courts acknowledged that the Supreme Court had been deprived of important facts in the Japanese internment case. In fact, very recently, the United States Supreme Court, in another immigration case, declared that the Korematsu case was wrong, that the Supreme Court had gotten it wrong, that the decision was wrong the day it was issued, the Supreme Court recently declared. And Korematsu has received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and all concentration camp survivors received $20,000 and an apology from President Bill Clinton. World War II had forced a reluctant people to fight for their citizenship. And the West Coast Japanese-American community came out of the experience scarred, but also transformed. But the war transformed an even larger group, if not fundamentally, at least temporarily. And that was the American woman. By 1942, the economy had pretty much absorbed all available supplies of male workers. And this left manufacturers in a bit of a bind. They had always been reluctant to hire women, claiming that male workers wouldn't stand for it. So now, to entice women into the factories while allaying anxieties about the consequences of change, the government inaugurated a major propaganda campaign. Women were a match for blue-collar industrial work, the government now said. Propaganda films such as Glamour Girls of 1943 assured women that heavy industry jobs weren't that different from housework. Quote, "Instead of cutting the lines of a dress, this woman cuts the pattern of aircraft parts. Instead of baking cake, this woman is cooking gears to reduce tension in the gears after use. After a short apprenticeship, this woman can operate a drill press just as easily as a juice extractor in her own kitchen." One industrial magazine celebrated the new industrial woman. And I quote, "She's 5'1" from her 4A slippers to her spun gold hair. She loves flower hats, veils, smooth orchestras, and being kissed by a boy who's now in North Africa. But man, oh man, how she can handle a heavy press." Fashions followed the trend, as in this ditty for Sanforized clothing. "Oh, aren't we cute and snappy in our coveralls and slacks? And since the tags say Sanforized, we'll stay as cute as tax." But of course, the government didn't think through the problem that this country has yet to think through since. What was the one thing these women desperately needed if they were going to work in these factories? Childcare. Mothers of small children found virtually no help. When the Federal Works Agency finally decided in 1943 to fund daycare centers for defense workers, their efforts met only a small portion of the demand. Newspapers ran stories of infants locked in cars parked in employee parking lots, young children shut up in apartments. Local communities tried to get at the problem. More than 4,400 communities established child care centers. But it wasn't enough, not by a long shot. By 1944, a survey found that 16% of mothers in war industries had no child care arrangements at all. Nonetheless, the government campaign to fill defense needs was very successful. 6 million women who never worked outside the home joined the labor force during the wars. Black and Mexican American women, though blocked from higher-level industrial jobs, began to enter the realm of female positions that had previously been reserved for whites, such as nursing and clerical positions. The war opened possibilities for women that they would not forget about in the post-war era. Indeed, the war opened possibilities for lots of people that they would not forget about in the post-war era as millions of Americans returned to civilian life. The New Deal and the Second World War experience raised the level of expectations for an entire generation of Americans. It redefined government, and it reinvigorated the idea that government existed to ensure rights, including the right to pursue one's happiness. And one fine day, 15 years after the end of World War II, 4 black teenagers showed up in a restaurant in Greensboro, North Carolina, demanding that right for themselves and defining the next chapter in our history of the United States, the civil rights era of the 1960s.